Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 10. In this chapter we're talking about, we're ending kind of the medieval times and we're going into the scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment. Now, if you watched the introduction before this, you already have an idea of the medieval worldview, especially the part about the cosmos as a ladder, the universe as a ladder. With God at the top, Earth at its base, and hell was just below Earth, which symbolically represents just how easy it is to mess up and then it is to strive to be good, right? So the key to the medieval worldview was that Earth was the center of the universe. The Earth was designed by God, and humans, as God's design, were lords of the planet. So keep in mind that that's where we're starting from medieval times. Now, the Renaissance led to the scientific revolution in a few different ways. First of all, the Renaissance interest in literature actually brought about some of the ancient scientific and math texts from before that, renewed interest in those. There's also the idea that nature was harmonious and understandable. So the idea that we could discuss nature and that we could get a grasp on why things happened kind of led into science because it was okay to explore why things happened. Also, the printing press during that time period became integral because literacy spread. I can't stress enough how important the printing press was. Not only could more people read and write after that, it made the pursuit of knowledge very individualistic. You didn't have to rely on a community leader to tell you what to think or what the law was. You could read it for yourself. You didn't have to wait for a priest to tell you what to think or what the religion rules were for you. You could read those for yourself. The printing press was integral in this period transitioning from the medieval times into the scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment. So I have a couple of favorite people here because they're very related in terms of what they did. Copernicus and Galileo. Copernicus was a Polish astronomer. He's actually known as the father of modern astronomy. He developed this heliocentric theory. Now remember, the medieval standard at the time is that Earth is the center of the universe, but Copernicus's heliocentric theory meant that the sun was the center of the universe. Now, keep in mind that Copernicus was a Christian, so he wouldn't have wanted to do anything that would upset his church. He very reluctantly published his heliocentric theory in 1543. And then he just kind of left it there. He just kind of pushed it as, what if, or this could be true, and just left it there. And it wasn't until the 1600s that people gained interest in it when Galileo actually proved his theory. So Copernicus's theory was not a challenge to the church. It wasn't until Galileo proved it that the church prohibited his book, Copernicus's book, in 1616. So now a little more about Galileo. He proclaimed a modern idea of nature's uniformity instead of this kind of ladder idea. He was the first person to use a telescope to actually study the heavens, and he discovered 4 moons that orbited Jupiter, which is what actually proved Copernicus's theory. By monitoring these, he saw the moons orbiting Jupiter and then, the whole orbital system of our universe. He also used math to study motion. And the big thing with Galileo, another part of his discovery that caused conflict within the church, and again, Galileo was also a Christian, was that Galileo determined from his study that the same rules that apply to Earth apply to the whole universe. There's not anything magical or mystical about the universe, that it's all something that we can study and understand. So you can see how that would hurt the church, right? I mean, the church relies on the mysticism of religion in order to garner uh, faith and faithful followers. So this was a knock to the church. And like we just talked about, Galileo's conflict with the church, honestly, was that while Copernicus just suggested this idea of heliocentrism, Galileo proved it. Again, he never meant, neither of them actually, never meant to undermine their faith. They were both Christian. Galileo actually believed that science was compatible with religion. So that alone was a new idea at the time, because remember, these are people, the medieval worldview was that, the cosmos was a ladder, kind of leading to the heavens. So we have Galileo who's saying, why can't we just understand the universe and make it compatible with religion? It's the idea that God created it all, according to Galileo. So he never said that God didn't create it. He just said that the theories were wrong about how it operated. So that was a kind of sour pill, or a big pill, for the church to swallow. Galileo believed that biblical scripture was for teaching salvation, not for the explanation of the operations of nature. He felt like that was science's role, and that God gave scientists the ability to do it. Galileo, for these kind of wild beliefs, was sentenced to life in prison, which was really basically house arrest at that point. And Copernicanism was banned. Now get this, it was finally lifted. The church finally lifted that ban in 1820. So, just a little over 200 years ago. When we say the church here, we're talking about the Catholic Church at this point in history. And Kepler is interesting too. Kepler was a philosopher who wrote a book in 1619 that attempted to explain this ancient theory that there's harmony, musical harmony, among all the motions in the universe, and that they all exist in harmony, so that all of the planets exist in harmony, and that their motions actually create music. Pythagoras is the one who started this stuff. Pythagoras is the one who said he could actually hear it sometimes. So now we generally associate Pythagoras with math because he's the guy that gave us what we call the Pythagorean theorem, the equation that says in a right triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So you might think it's odd that Pythagoras would have this theory about the heavens, but during his time, Pythagoras was really less known for math and more known for his numerology, these religious theories about numbers. Now, since we connect Pythagoras to triangles, you might think that his religion or his religious beliefs actually related to number 3. But really, Pythagoras developed a cult following for his theory about the number 1. We know his cult theory today as Pythagoreanism. He believed that 1 was the ultimate perfect number, just like religions often believe in an ultimate perfect God. So he believes in this ultimate perfect number. Pythagoras taught that odd numbers were male and even numbers were female. So in today's world, we think of 1 as an odd number, which would make it male. However, Pythagoras taught that 1 was not male or female, that because it was the source of all numbers, because adding 1 to anything magically changed the number, and subtracting 1 from anything also magically changed that number. So Pythagoras had this kind of lots of interesting ideas. Kepler picked up on the one about the music of the spheres, and Pythagoras was the first to discuss it, and then Plato even discussed it. Neither of them could prove it. And Kepler also tried to prove it and did not. His biggest accomplishment as an astronomer was developing the laws of planetary motion. And we will talk about that here. So the laws of planetary motion are that the planets demonstrated an elliptical orbit, that they don't move at uniform speeds, they accelerate when they're near the sun. And he drew a mathematical relationship between the time it takes a planet to complete its orbit of the sun and its average distance from the sun. Now, he discovered these things, but he really didn't understand why. And that's what Isaac Newton did. So Sir Isaac Newton gave us the laws of motion. He said that a body at rest stays at rest unless an action of another force is made upon it, and that a body in motion continues in a straight line at the same velocity unless a force acts on it. So basically, the medieval people believed that a moving body needed a force to keep it moving. And Isaac Newton is saying that that's not true in his rule about inertia. He said that a given force produces a measurable change in a body's velocity, that a body's change of velocity is proportional to the force acting on it. And the one that, if you're not very sciencey, you usually remember this because it's the short one, right? It's the easy one to remember. For every action or force, there is an equal and opposite reaction or force. Now, I included this because here's Sir Isaac Newton here, right? He's this muscular guy using a compass to determine something, looking all smart and stuff. Here's the Sir Isaac Newton I grew up with.
Down, 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 gravity. Help and wash the dishes, and I drop a cup. Why does everything fall down instead of up? Right up into a spill and hit the ground. Wish I could fall up instead of always falling down. Down, 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 down. I'm a victim of gravity. Everything keeps falling down on me. No matter where I go, the forces that I know. Down, 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 down. It's all around town now. It's like a magnet deep inside the ground. When I lift something up, I can feel it pulling down. It pulls me in the pool. It comes rain down on me. I'm a victim of down, 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 gravity. Galileo, Galileo experiments with a force he couldn't see. Galileo gets to Earth at the very same speed. Galileo knows that was due to gravity. The moon goes round the Earth and shines its silver light. The Earth goes round the sun and makes the seasons right. It is love that makes the world go round, you see. Power of gravity. But please, don't tell Mary T. Without Earth's gravity to keep us in our place, we'd have no way at all while we in outer space. The sea was blown away and so was fields and towns. Down, 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 down. Yeah. Isaac Newton underneath the apple tree. One hit him on the head, he said that must be gravity. Newton's law of gravity says that every object in the universe pulls on every other object. The bigger the object, the stronger the pull. So the greater the distance between the objects, the weaker the pull becomes. Come back, Mary Jean. Don't call me clumsy, don't call me a fool. When things fall down on me, I'm following the rule. The rule that says that what goes up comes down like me. I will lift up, down, 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 gravity. Shoo-be-doo, down, down.
so back to the slides now after that little bit of schoolhouse rock. But you can see the difference between, obviously, this Isaac Newton and this Isaac Newton. Anyway, so here's some important things to remember about Isaac Newton. He also was a Christian. He thought of God as the grand architect of all, just like Galileo. You know, Galileo thought that science and religion worked hand in hand. Now, the church didn't see it that way, but Newton also felt the same way. God was the one who created everything in Newton's eyes, and so God was a grand architect. He believed that God periodically intervened to restore energy to the cosmic system, that there were no conflicts between divine miracles and mechanics of the universe in that way. So, you know, with Galileo proving heliocentrism, he said, there's nothing magic out there. But Newton said, I don't know, there could be some magic out there, right? I mean, God can mystically bring about a miracle, and why not? You know, so that's how he kind of kept that in check. And Isaac Newton's mechanical universe and adherence to the experimental method formed the basic premises of what's going to become the Age of Enlightenment. So you saw in the little video Galileo dropping 2 different sized stones from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and you see the apple dropping on Isaac Newton's head. So these are experiments, right? And so this whole scientific method that develops during this time period is what leads us into the Age of Enlightenment. So as we start talking about enlightenment, let's talk about different kinds of reasoning. There's inductive reasoning, which is also known as empirical reasoning. Francis Bacon is often connected with that. We'll talk a little more about Francis Bacon in another video. Inductive reasoning observes nature carefully, collects data, draws conclusions from that data, and then tests conclusions from that data. They test conclusions in those experiments. Deductive reasoning, or rational reasoning, which was promoted by Descartes, the founder of modern philosophy, uses math and theoretical physics in order to study things. You start with a principle, and then you use logic to find more truths from it. So let's see here. Consequences of the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution fostered a rational and critical spirit in intellectual circles. So people are starting to think, and it's in vogue to think. It got rid of a lot of superstition. So much of civilization, if you've taken the civilization through the 16th century course, you know that so much of society was based on the developments of superstitions in order to explain things. So the scientific revolution gets rid of that need to rely on superstition, because now if you can study it, it can be explained, and that's being permitted. The scientific revolution was eventually embraced by religion, with the idea that God created uniformity and natural laws. But ultimately, it weakened traditional Christianity because it eliminated the idea, or the dependency might be a better word, of miracles. Scientists insisted that God was such a master planner that the miracles just weren't needed. This scientific revolution also gave thinkers confidence in the power of their minds, and that's what leads to the Age of Enlightenment. So enlightenment, a good definition of enlightenment is just basically knowing. You know, the Age of Enlightenment is the age of knowing, the age of revelation, the age of learning and determining and understanding things. Philosophers or thinkers, you might recognize that word, sounds a lot like philosophy. The philosophers were thinkers. They worked toward a more rational, humane society. And the Age of Enlightenment applies the scientific method to the human world, to study people and society The philosophes believed that science was on the side of good, but that theology and priests were inherently wicked. They thought that it was really bad that churches frightened and confused people to control them. And so that broke with the Christian past. So they broke with the Christian past, although they kept the morals from their religion. In terms of politics, the philosophes were against despotism. So despotism is a ruler who has absolute power, and they're very often cruel and oppressive. So an enlightened despot then would be a ruler who had absolute power, maybe even sometimes cruel and oppressive, but a little more open to humanitarian efforts. The philosophes also promoted secularism. This idea of the separation of church and state started forming with this time. And the philosophes favored constitutional governments with checks and balances. So you can kind of see where we're going here. This is the formation of early government systems that actually resemble our own. We can, if we were to sit down and study American government, we could actually pick out some elements of these that are still in place today. Now, the philosophes, however, did not favor democracy. Democracy is, vote by the people, all the people. But they had very little faith in most people. They didn't think a lot of people were smart enough in order to make those kind of decisions on their behalf. And we see that in our own founding fathers in the United States as well. Most philosophes favored reforming despots who accepted these Enlightenment ideas. One example of those despots would be Frederick II of Prussia. People who were willing to make some concessions to promote humanism. So two people who are really important during this time period are Hobbes and Locke. And like I mentioned before, some of their ideas are some that we can still see in our own government today. They were different. They had different ideas. Hobbes believed that people are just generally selfish. Locke, however, said people are reasonable. Hobbes said that government should protect natural rights. So we're getting into that in this time period, the idea of natural rights. Locke, however, said that the government should really control this selfish behavior and control chaos. That it wasn't there to protect natural rights, it should be there for control. Hobbes said the ideal government is democracy. Locke, however, said the ideal government would be absolute monarchy with no divine right. So divine right is the idea that God has selected this monarch to lead. According to Hobbes, human rights were life, liberty, and property. And Locke believed that people had the rights to give to the government. So two very different kind of outlooks that are developing during the Age of Enlightenment. From two very important philosophers, Hobbes and Locke. So there were some additional philosophers that were important in this time period. Montesquieu advocated for the separation of powers into legislative, executive, and judiciary branches. Again, that sounds very familiar to us, doesn't it? Voltaire was a propagandist and a polemicist who was basically a writer who promoted certain causes or someone who writes against theology. He fought for freedom of religion, religious tolerance, fair criminal justice, fair taxing, and to end clergy and nobility privileges in France. Rousseau wanted a genuine democracy of people devoted to their community. He suggested education reforms to teach children to be productive, responsible citizens and to think for themselves. So Rousseau wanted to teach kids critical thinking. He wanted to keep the innocence of childhood and teach them through fun experiences like play, curiosity, using their imagination. That's one of the early proponents of the kind of child education that we still recognize today. He did have a different view, though. I would challenge this idea of democracy of people. I would say probably democracy of men. We'll talk about that in a minute. And Diderot was the first to attempt to compile an inclusive, all-inclusive encyclopedia. Now, this encyclopedia ended up being banned by Pope Clement XIII in 1759 because it had a lot of information in there that the church didn't really like. So as these philosophers continue to work toward these humanitarian efforts, they want to eliminate torture, which led to prison reforms. They promoted war as barbaric and not reasonable, and many at this point are already condemning slavery. And just to define humanitarianism, that would be the promotion of human welfare. So let's talk about slavery in the 1700s with someone that we recognize from American history, Ben Franklin. We know Ben Franklin had slaves, and so he was a proponent for slavery. He started eventually condemning slavery, and he had freed his by about 1770. The common thought that Franklin and others subscribed to was that slaves could not learn. They just basically were not educated. You got to remember, in this kind of master and slave environment, what we're really looking at is a superior figure and an inferior figure. So it was really not surprising that superior figures determined that their inferiors would not be able to learn. So that was common practice. Many slaves were not taught to read or write. In 1763, however, Franklin wrote that slaves didn't learn because of lack of education and because of the negative environments that they were in, not because they were inferior, because they weren't given the chance. In 1787, he wrote to ask for donations to help freed slaves adjust to life through education and suitable employment. And then in 1790, he petitioned to Congress to end slavery. Now that was immediately rejected, but he did petition to end slavery as early as 1790. So here are a couple more slave facts from the 1700s. Thomas Paine helped write the act that would abolish slavery in Pennsylvania in 1780, which is 10 years before Franklin suggested it for the nation. In 1791, British Parliament denied abolition of slave trade. They approved abolishing the slave trade in 1807. So several years later, but they did abolish the slave trade in 1807. So let's talk a little about women of the 1700s. The philosophers still considered women as inferior, both intellectually and morally. Rousseau, that I mentioned before, who wanted children to learn in a fun environment, he is quoted as saying, "A female wit is a scourge to her husband, her children, her friends, her servants, to everybody. From the lofty height of her genius, she scorns every womanly duty, and she's always trying to make a man of herself." So Rousseau did not really think that women deserved equal rights. He felt like women were inferior, which is common to the time period. So if you're a woman listening to this lecture, this always kind of rubs women the wrong way. It's just how it was. And we have to analyze these things in their context. So despite the feelings of the masses, the philosophers' concentration on humanitarian concepts of equality, the first steps toward a women's movement were at least made possible. So we're at least kind of starting to think, hey, if it's okay to educate slaves, maybe it's a good idea to educate women as well. Slaves can learn, maybe women can learn. So we have this idea opening up that people who have been considered inferior may not be quite as inferior as previously decided. One female writer of the era, Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote The Vindication of Rights of Women in 1792. She wrote that women were to men as slaves were to masters or subjects were to monarchs. And she considered it tyranny for women not to have equal rights. She argued that, like slaves, women just simply lacked education. They were not inferior, they just had never been given the opportunity. So let's just briefly brush across economics, laissez-faire economics to be specific. So that means without government interference. So laissez-faire means without government interference. We're talking about economics without government interference. This became a 19th century liberal principle. Adam Smith, who is the guy in the picture here, said that government intervention slows economic progress and it reduces the value of land and labor. He said that when people pursue their own interests, they work harder to earn better conditions for themselves and their families, which leads ultimately to a better economy and a better society. Smith wrote An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Usually you'll just see it referred to as Wealth of Nations or The Wealth of Nations. So touching base now on war and revolution of the time. In 1740, Prussia, which was ruled at the time by Frederick the Great, launched a successful war against Austria. Maria Theresa, the Austrian queen, retaliated in 1756 and joined France to fight Prussia. This is called the 7 Years' War. During the 7 Years' War, France was fighting England over their claims in the New World, which is called the French and Indian War. So lots of wars going on at this time. Strapped from the expense of fighting the French, the British sought to pay their war debt by charging new colonial taxes. And we know how that went. The colonists didn't like it at all. They felt like it was taxation without representation, and they revolted, which leads to the colonies writing the Declaration of Independence to focus on natural rights, which is something we've that have developed during this time period, right? Natural rights. The United States of America wins the Revolutionary War in 1783. Washington became a great leader. France helped the United States during the Revolution, basically to get revenge for losing the 7 Years' War to England. Britain had several battles going on, and really they just didn't commit to the struggle in what is now the United States. Had they committed, it might have been a different story. So I mentioned before that despotism is ruled by an absolute monarch, which usually ends up being cruel and oppressive. An enlightened despot would be a strong monarch who implements reforms for freedoms and rational philosophies. And as I previously mentioned, Frederick the Great of Prussia was one of those. Catherine the Great of Russia was one. Charles III of Spain, Maria Theresa, who I mentioned just previously, and Joseph II of Austria, and Louis XV in France are considered enlightened despots. So with all of these philosophers thinking and giving us ideas, there were some critiques, obviously, that came about from their work. Some of the critiques of the philosophers included that they overvalued intellect at the expense of emotions and feelings. Basically, intellect didn't allow for creative development. They criticized that the philosophers didn't try to understand the past by the past standards, that they judged based on their own modern standards. And that's an easy thing to do. And it's not the right thing to do. That's why I gave you that reminder just a few minutes ago. You got to remember the standards of the past so you can understand how things developed. So when you judge the past by the past standards, then you can reflect on the past by today's standards. How did you get here? Is that where you wanted to go? Is it better now than it was then? Those sorts of things. Another critique was that the idea of universal truths could lead to fanaticism, like Robespierre and his reign of terror. And the idea is that their emphasis on science would eliminate social order. That, however, did not happen. So that's a plus. So that's a plus we can chalk up for the philosophers. Okay, so that's a lot to cover in Chapter 10. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know.